A lot of you were emailing us about this cooler, and it's immediately obvious why. This is a $40 cooler. We are calling this a flat tower design because it's a dual fan tower cooler, but it's flattened. Let's just put it next to an NHD15 for an example here. There's your size comparison. Still two fans. They do go for shorter fans though, so these are 15 millimeter depth. The standard case fan or cooler fan is 25 millimeters. So they're cutting about 10 millimeters off of the thickness of the fans here. Let's not knock over the Noctua cooler. It's very heavy and it will scratch the glass. But this cooler actually really surprised us in performance. So when we look at thermals today, think it's not just a meme product. It seemed like it was a meme product, but it's not. And that's a nice change. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut and Cryonaut thermal pastes are high-performing thermal interfaces for use on CPUs and GPUs. You can bring an old card back to peak performance by repasting it and doing preventative maintenance, and Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut is ideal for water cooling and air cooling for new and old cards alike. Cryonaut paste is one of the top-performing pastes for extreme overclocking with CPUs and GPUs, and has been used in several world record-scoring machines. Learn more at the link in the description below. Some background on the company. So the company is called Jiushark, and the Chinese name is Jiusha, which literally just translates to 9 shark, like the number 9 shark. I don't know if there's any significance to that particular name, but that's what it translates to. So Jiushark is how they've converted it into English. And they're relatively new. The company's been around since about 2018. It's a Dongguan-based company. And Scythe, the other cooler manufacturer, is actually a distributor for Jiushark. They are the distributor, I think, in Japan for Jiushark's products. So they're pretty new. It's only going on about 5 years at this point. And this is an exciting one to look at. Other than the mounting, this cooler is actually pretty straightforward. The clear goal was low profile, and that's why they went with shorter fans, but they've also shoved in 7 heat pipes to the Coldplate. So there's not only a lot of surface area, but a lot of heat pipes to try and wick the heat away despite this tiny overall size. This is the Amazon Basics cooler that we reviewed a few weeks ago. This is a 92 millimeter fan. So the tower is a little taller than 92 millimeters. This is 92 millimeters tall, like from the bottom of the cold plate to the top of the fans. So it is the height, roughly, of the Amazon fan itself. And it's better than it in performance. But you look at it, and that's kind of a lot of surface area. They've really packed it in here. For sizing, this is 120 millimeters in this dimension, so wide, which makes sense because the fans are 120s, despite the smaller height. And the height, as stated, is 92 millimeters. And the last dimension here ends up being 241 millimeters long. So this is not a new motherboard, but it doesn't really matter. So if you were to mount this on a board, it ends up mounting something like this. And we've probably got shots of it installed. So you can see here as well, down at a low angle, the RAM clearance is actually pretty damn good. I mean, you would have to have a ridiculously tall thing with fans on top of it for that to become a problem. Now, before we get too carried away with the possibilities of this being a better than expected cooler, there were some downsides. So some fit and finish issues and quality control issues. Critically, we noticed an occasional fan noise and rattle. It's not constant. It kind of came and went, but that's part of the problem. And just here's what it sounds like. This would be more noticeable in open cases or in ultra-silent systems, something where you don't have any other noise really. But part of the problem is, again, that it's not constant, and that makes it harder to pinpoint and identify the noise so you could potentially fix it. It also makes it much more obvious when it starts. So that was a little annoying. As a much lesser complaint, visually we noticed there's some paint drip around it. So this is something of a nitpick, but manufacturers often fix things after we mention them, so it's worth pointing out. This is just a byproduct of the painting process they're using for some parts of the cooler. In fact, the heat pipes are also painted. Rather than using an electrical treatment or a plating, they're literally just painting them. And while this technically can affect performance in a negative direction, the impact is often negligible unless you're talking high end. And finally, in the fit and finish category, we noticed some errors in the installation guide within the manual. The screws labeled L are said to be black screws, but they're actually silver. It's not a big deal, it's just it would confuse users and lead them to look for the wrong thing. Because there are black screws, but those are labeled E. So they got at least one or both of those labels halfway right. The fans are acting in a downdraft fashion at any motherboard's VRM. Now, this side will get hit more directly, whereas the top one, you're not going to get as much of an impact, but it's additionally seated over the memory, and for DDR5, that can be useful, but it would help because you got direct airflow on two components that are typically not considered when choosing a CPU cooler. That Coldplate's actually got a pretty nice finish to it, but we'll look at that in the pressure testing. The pressure mount on this is, in one of the tests anyway, phenomenal. Within this channel, there is these wedge fins. They come down and they split like a T. So it acts as a support. And the reason they do that is because there's a little bit of rock. You can actually maybe see it right now, where on compression, this plate rocks a little bit. It's not a bad thing because you think about it and ultimately it's being secured to a hard surface which will not conform to that rocking motion, but it does mean that there's some flex there, and fortunately they've designed for it. So that's what all that support is for, is to give it some sort of rigidity, even though it's not perfectly stable when installing it. But that brings me to the next point, which is installation is a little bit of a pain in the ass. Mike's gonna talk about that later. The main thing though is you'll notice the screw holes are here, and to really get on the board, well, he'll talk about it, but we found that installing the board to the cooler rather than the cooler to the board was much easier. So that's enough talking about the cooler. We're gonna get into the thermals now. Quick explainer reminder on the thermals. First of all, we have a whole methodology video that's still pretty relevant today because we still do things mostly the same way. That is linked in the description below for our cooler testing methodology. There's a few important things though. First of all, we do multiple mounts per review. So if you're not familiar with our testing methodology, we don't just install it once, run it, collect some numbers, and that's it. What we do is at least 2 to 3 mounts of the cooler per CPU, and we test typically 2 CPUs, sometimes 3. So you're already up somewhere in the range of 4 to 6, maybe as much as 9 for remounts for the testing process. Each of those mounts gets 3 to 5 typically test passes. So on the high end, might be looking at 10 to maybe 15 test passes to run it through the 3950X or like a 120 watt heat load or whatever it is. It's a lot of test validation, and we just like to point it out because not many people do that much test validation. We found it necessary because the variance in run to run or mount to mount can be enough to be equivalent to the perceived gap on a chart between two coolers. And so we run all those tests to make sure we can kind of normalize for that variance and get numbers that are as truly comparable as possible without just accidentally ending up basically showing the difference between a good and a bad mount. And typically in sample size testing, we've seen there's really not much of a difference between how many samples you test. It more comes down to how it's installed, because there's a lot of mechanical elements with it. And if you happen to torque it a little bit differently one time or the next, as you'll see in our pressure testing today, that can affect the results. For noise testing, we do all the testing in a controlled environment with a 26 dBA noise floor. Very quiet. It's kind of equivalent to like a suburban house when there's no street traffic, there's no air conditioning running, all the windows are closed, and it's like 3 a.m. That's like the equivalent noise level for where we start with. That testing is taken at 20 inches distance, and we do that for all coolers, so they're all comparable. And I was talking with Mike, who runs all the testing for thermals on these, and he asked, hey, how much time do you think we spend on a cooler? How long does it actually spend in testing? So I ran some numbers on it. The whole time to produce a cooler review, it's somewhere in the range of 40 hours just to review the cooler. And at least 8 of those are running basically sort of non-stop for the tests themselves, not counting all the manual labor of mount, remount. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. We greatly appreciate that you all find value in the information. And as always, you can support the further testing for things like this on store.gamersnexus.net, where you can grab our solder mats, our mod mats, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, which is an awesome place to give a couple bucks and get some behind the scenes videos. We just published 2 in the last week or 2 as well, by the way. So enough of all that, let's get into some of the numbers. We'll start with a 200 watt heat load and noise normalized RPM at 35 dBA and 20 inches distance for testing. This amount of heat is enough to push most air coolers closer to the limits, especially if they're the cheaper kind, although the dual fan towers tend to hang in there pretty well. The Jiushark cooler ran at 61 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, which roughly ties it with the Fuma 2. That's a great start. Despite being technically in last place on this chart, we still have a little bit of room to accommodate 200-watt CPUs with this cooler. Towers with significant surface area and a modernized dual tower design do better, like the Deepcool AK620 at 57 degrees over ambient, and that couple degrees actually does start to matter here. 3 to 4 degrees when talking about coolers is a big advantage, and once you factor back in ambient, it gets you a lot further away from a potential TJ Maxx. The Peerless Assassin maintains its impressive position with a 4-degree advantage, but the Jiushark's cooling here is better than we'd expect. You also wouldn't want to use this on a hotter CPU than we're testing here, but it's still a good start. But the Jiushark should really shine with VRM thermals. We always collect these numbers. It's just rare that we present them because they're not typically interesting, except for things like the Liquid Freezer 2's VRM fan, where there's a clear objective by the product to cool the VRM. The JF13K is pointed straight down though, so you can't get much more direct for cooling on the memory and the VRM than that. Our VRM testing collects thermals for the hottest MOSFETs on the motherboard. Liquid coolers are mounted immediately adjacent to the VRM, so it's basically like a top mount in a computer case where the radiator, the fans, would be right next to the board. So that gives liquid coolers a bit of an advantage, and if you plan to mount your radiator in the front, your results would be warmer. Our next heat load will add a lot more air coolers, but for this one, since a lot of those can't handle 200 watts, we're going to just focus on the same list from last time, and here it is. The Jiushark cooler measured at 44 degrees over ambient for the first measurement, with VRM2 measurement at 33.5 degrees over ambient. Depending on which MOSFET you look at, the results vary. The Jiushark cooler is currently the best air-cooled result for VR MOSFET number 2, that's the orange bar, but is otherwise average for the FETs that are closer to the I/O on the motherboard. This would make it a very strong consideration in something like a small form factor or an ITX case, where you don't have much direct airflow otherwise. And now we're dropping one of our controls and exchanging it for a variable. We're moving to 100% fan speed, and that allows coolers to brute force their way to the top of the chart, but it's at the expense of noise. This is done at the 200-watt heat load first, and so it shuffles the coolers a little bit. The chart shows that the Jiushark cooler runs at 57 degrees over ambient here, now surpassing the Fuma 2. That makes sense. The Fuma 2 was already at its max volume on the previous chart at 34.4 dBA, with no room to scale the fans up. They don't go faster. The Jiushark cooler increased its noise level to 41.2 dBA. It's noticeable to humans, and as a result, it reduced its temperature. People tend to notice about every 3 dBA movement, and once you get to 10 dBA, it's perceived as an audible doubling of noise to the human ear. And we're not talking in terms of acoustic power, but in terms of perceived volume. That's the important distinction there. The cooler here is encroaching on the louder NHD15, but the NHD15 has been outmoded by nearly all modern coolers. The Peerless Assassin that we recently reviewed is at 53 degrees over ambient here. It's a noteworthy improvement for hotter CPUs, but that doesn't change the Jiushark's impressive marks. The JF13K is actually killing it right now for its overall stature. Time to move to an easier load and introduce a ton of other coolers, like the Amazon Basics model that we reviewed a couple weeks ago. Here's the 35 dBA noise-normalized chart for a 123-watt heat load. The JF13K ran at 56 degrees over ambient here, establishing its position as equal to the NHD15. It's not surprising, and it's for a few reasons. The larger ones tend to do better, and their sort of capacity, so to speak, is higher. You'll see a longer ramp time on the soak to steady state. All of these things are beneficial, especially with spiky behavior. So that's one aspect, where with a lower heat load, these just don't look as good as they would under a higher one. The second aspect is much simpler. This is old. This is like a really old design. So they just need a newer one. It's as simple as that, really. Compared to the more relevant newer coolers, the JF13K falls behind further. The single tower AK400 puts itself in an impressive position hierarchically, as does the Thermalright Assassin Spirit at 58 degrees. That's another single tower. The Noctua NHU14S benefits from the larger fan, and as another single tower, it lands alongside the Freezer 34, which is a dual fan cooler. At 100% fan speed and running the 123-watt load, the JF13K was within error of all the other relevant coolers. This just isn't enough heat load to establish a meaningful ranking here, especially with that higher fan speed, and it goes to show that for low enough power loads like this one, you can use basically any half-decent air cooler and it'll perform roughly the same as some of the best air coolers, and that's just because the differences don't emerge here. It's not stressful enough for them. So now we're going to go to the mechanical and installation section, and Mike will walk you all through that. He spent hands-on time with the cooler. He has done hundreds of installation and uninstallation passes with all the coolers over the last couple of years. So he has a lot of experience to speak from. And additionally, he's got some critiques with this design.
So the primary demonstration today is going to be on AM4. Then we'll talk about the differences with Intel and AM5. The brackets for the AM4 installation require some assembly, so we're going to do that first here. They come with 4 screws that slot in and are actually keyed on the bottom here to prevent them from spinning, but they slot into the bottom of these brackets, and they're held in place by the actual standoffs that are going to, that would go on the top of the motherboard. Now these standoffs have a brass or metal insert that is actually offset within the standoff. So you have to make sure to orient these correctly. There's actually kind of like a hole in one side, there's some space, and we want that space pointed down towards the head of the screw. And if you don't do that, you won't be able to tighten it all the way, and we'll get some B-roll footage of that. But so I'm gonna go ahead and get the rest of these put together. Oops. Don't film that. And now it's time to attach them to the cooler body itself. So we want this the bracket to be facing and kind of like curving down, these little indentations we want going down. So I'm gonna orient that like that. And we'll of course walk it backwards. Now each bracket is obviously held in by 2 screws, so pretty simple. Now we're ready to actually mount it to the motherboard, and this is where things get a little weird and abnormal. First thing we're going to want to do is put thermal paste on our CPU. So I'm going to grab our motherboard here. And as a disclaimer, of course, for all our testing, we do manually spread the thermal paste. This is just for demonstration. I'm also going to stage my other parts here. So I want this bracket to be handy, and I also want these spacers to be handy during this process. So I've actually got the spacers installed on the backplate already with the adhesive side to the backplate so that I can just slot it all down at once. You can do that, or you can put the spacers on to each individual screw once we have the motherboard in place. We want to make sure the cooler is oriented correctly. So the heat pipes we want closest to the GPU. We want this non-heat pipe side towards the top of the motherboard or your prospective case. So I've got the RAM closest to me, and I've got the thinnest side closest to me. So I think we're ready for this little song and dance. And we're down. So now we're ready to put our bracket into place. And now we're going to take these nuts, these really small nuts, and we're going to just get them started and threaded on there kind of loosely. All right, so I've got those started. Now they include a tool here for securing these nuts down. It does have a Phillips head slot on the top of it. It's also got knurling on it, like a thumb screw, and I've found that during testing that just using the knurling I can get plenty of torque. You obviously can use a driver. The installation instructions tell you to use a driver, and we're just gonna alternate here and tighten this down. Okay, and that wraps up the AM4 installation. Let's take a look at the Intel hardware really quick, and then we'll move on to AM5. The Intel installation is almost identical to what we just looked at, except it's got different screws that are, of course, keyed differently for the Intel brackets. All right, and finally, let's talk about the AM5. This is the first time we've had to call attention to this because it's actually quite an endeavor, because you unfortunately have to remove the stock AM5 socket in order to install this. And you have to do that because you have to switch out the backplate. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. The socket has 4 Torx T20 screws that hold the backplate into place. As you can see, the screws here are captive within the socket itself. So we're going to set that aside. Now we have our exposed AM5 socket, and I'm going to just gently coerce that backplate free. Now that it's out, I'm going to grab our Jiushark backplate. So this backplate actually has 2 different surfaces. It's got a metal surface, and then it's got a plastic surface. So we're going to want that plastic surface facing the PCB. So we want that facing up in this case. And then we're going to, again, very carefully place our socket back down into place and secure it. So this actually, as I'm tightening these with our T20 Allen key here, it brings up our first criticism, and that would be that the tool that they included is actually the wrong size. So this over here, this is our T20, which is from a contact frame kit. And this came with a T15. I'm really not sure why they did that. Both the Torx for AM5 and for LGA 1700 are T20. So if we take the T15 that they sent, you can see it, well, it'll grip, but there is a ton of play in there, and that's just not good. I'm just not a fan of that. But with the proper T20, it has a nice snug fit. So with the socket installed, with their backplate, you'd be ready to go ahead and install the cooler on your AM5 platform. Now, criticisms. This cooler's tough to install. It's not very straightforward. It probably has some risks of getting bad thermal paste spread because you're potentially rocking the motherboard as you're trying to get everything into place. So it was finicky. It took me a couple practice tries before I was confident in that in getting a good mount for our testing purposes. But beyond them including the wrong tool and it being kind of difficult to mount, I don't really know of what I'd change to keep that mechanical profile and make the mounting any easier. They've kind of pigeonholed themselves into having to mount from the back of the motherboard. But beyond that, all the hardware was nice, everything fit together well, and I didn't have any problems mechanically with any of the components that were included. So that wraps up the installation segment, and now I'm going to throw it back to Steve.
Now we're going to the pressure testing. This doesn't represent flatness of the plate, but it represents the quality of the mounting solution. And that's one of the areas that these cheaper coolers, they sometimes really screw it up. Like, actually the Amazon one was horrible. It was one of the worst pressure mounts we have ever seen. But this one was good. So we use a NIST traceable scanner and a special process for this. This was made possible by our supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/gamersnexus. Let's take a look. Measured first on the 3800X, the pressure scan is almost perfect for coverage. That's nearly 100% coverage across the entire IHS, with the highest pressure centrally and at the edges. This is in contention for the best pressure scan we've ever conducted here. But there's a downside. The next scan that we're revealing now lacked coverage alongside the bottom right and far edges of the same CPU. This was on our second mount. As Mike showed in the installation section, the trickier mounting process leaves room for potential user error. And be mindful of the end result after you install this cooler, because there may be room to improve. This scan is still better than most though, so you wouldn't throw away too much performance. It's just that it has more potential than this. The 3950X scans were a mix of these two results, but overall similar. We end up with a clean average when looking at all of these that represents mostly good mounting pressure with some variability, more than we typically see. So overall, we're actually pretty happy with this cooler, which is very rare for me to say any of those words in a sentence like that. But it's because of a number of things. This isn't something that it's like a best. We're not interested in it because it's like the Peerless Assassin, where the Peerless Assassin it's really good value. It performs well, it's cheap, it's a pretty clear win. But that's not what this is. The reason we like this one is because it's cool and it's different. And in that regard, it's almost like the Sakura card or the Yeston Cute Pet cards. So because it's different, it's immediately interesting. This opens up a lot of cool possibilities. Now, it's not the first cooler to do this, to be very clear. I think it might have been Ryzen Tech I saw do it originally, and it was one of their like basically VGA coolers for a CPU, if I'm remembering that right. But they're not the first ones. It's just this is a modern option that installs on modern CPUs, and it works pretty well. That's the crux of it, where it's like, it's great to be unique, but if it can't perform, it's kind of irrelevant. This one manages to do at least good enough for the performance. It can handle a 200-watt CPU. That's pretty damn good, with some caveats there, like don't stuff it into a hot case, while also getting a pretty good overall finish on it. The white coloring came out nice. They don't have this sort of mismatched coloring that you typically see with a white for a cooler, where as it transitions from plastic to metal, different types of metal, they're all different shades. This is pretty well matched. And mechanically, it is odd, and it's kind of frustrating to install. There's some places we could see improvements, like they should probably put some holes through the cooler so it's a little easier to work with. But still, from a structural standpoint, they've done pretty well to reinforce places where it's clearly going to be a weak point. And they've also maximized the surface area in a pretty effective way. So wrapping up then, couple fit and finish issues. The fan rattle was the only one that would really be worth being aware of, and that is a solvable problem. You would need to put a damper somewhere, but probably it's going to be a little different cooler to cooler, and it never rattled long enough or consistently enough for us to identify it and then guess and check. So we're doing a test, so we couldn't interfere with it. So that's the number one problem. The rest of them were kind of minor, other than just be aware installation can be frustrating, follow Mike's instructions. It's really unique market positioning for the size, and we think at $30 to $50 range it makes sense. I think it's 40 right now, that seems fine. You might have to buy it from Taobao or JD or AliExpress or something like that. It may have made it to the US by now, but that's where we ended up seeing it on, I think it was Taobao. So, and then the last point here is it's not trash. We thought it was going to be a meme cooler because a lot of you emailed us, and that normally means, ha, funny component, send it to Steve so Steve becomes funny man. But this wasn't that, so checkmate. Try again, send us the next one you think is a meme. We'll look at that too, and maybe it will be. But until then, the cooler is actually kind of legit. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.